Welcome, welcome, Augustonians. Thank you for joining Lit Friday for our conversation with Dr. Fields-Black, author of Combee, Harriet Tubman, the Combahee River Raid, and Black Freedom During the Civil War from Oxford University Press. National Book Award-winning Harvard professor Dr. Imani Perry says of Combee, Dr. Edda Fields-Black takes a legendary event and an iconic figure, and with path-breaking research and elegant prose, gives us a striking, living, and breathing history of Black courage and freedom dreams at the dawn of emancipation. As I read Combee myself, Dr. Fields-Black's critical and painstaking research, ecological, political, social, and emotional, illuminated the past for me in such a way that it flashed before my eyes. Combee grounds Harriet Tubman and her extraordinary faith, strategy, determination, and creativity in her lived humanity. This is a timely publication as it reveals, with unabashed clarity, the truth of our nation's origins and practices around race and how systemic surveillance and racism continue to shape our contemporary policies and culture. Before we have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Fields-Black and hear her read from Combee, I want to give an update on Lit Friday. For 2025, Lit Friday will focus on 4 high-impact conversations, the first of which is we are honored to have featured Dr. Edda Fields-Black. And coming months, we will have a poetry reading, an interview with Abiodun Ayaule of The Last Poets, a conversation with Emmy Award-winning director Aimé Alaquiva, and his documentary, The Ebony Canal, which features narration from Viola Davis, and Dr. Brittany Webb, the Evelyn and Will Kaplan Curator of 20th Century Art, and the John Roden Collection from the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. So between those new conversations, we'll be hitting replay and reintroducing you to our archive of conversations. And now, I will introduce Dr. Edda Fields-Black. Dr. Edda Fields-Black teaches history at Carnegie Mellon University and serves as director of the Dietrich College Humanities Center. She has written extensively about the history of West African rice farmers, including in such works as Deep Roots, Rice Farmers in West Africa and the African Diaspora. She was a co-editor of Rice, Global Networks and New Histories, which was selected as a Choice Outstanding Academic Title. Fields-Black has served as a consultant for the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture's permanent exhibition, Rice Fields in the Low Country of South Carolina. She is the executive producer and librettist of Unburied, Unmourned, Unmarked, Requiem for Rice, a widely performed original contemporary classical work by celebrated composer John Wineglass. Fields-Black is a descendant of Africans enslaved on rice plantations in Colleton County, South Carolina. Her great-great-great-grandfather fought in the Combahee River Raid in June 1863. Her determination to illuminate the riches of the Gullah dialect and to reclaim Gullah Geechee history and culture has taken her to the rice fields of South Carolina and Georgia, to those of Sierra Leone and Republic of Guinea and West Africa. Thank you so much for having this conversation with me, Dr. Fields-Black. I cannot wait to get into this. But first, everybody has to hear you read a part of this incredible braid of stories that you've told us.
Yes. Do you want me to read it first or do you want me to frame it first?
Let's start with the framing and then jump into the reading. I'm going to let you have the stage and
Okay.
you can take it away from there.
Okay, sounds good. So, greetings, everyone. It is truly a pleasure to be with you today and to talk with you about Combee and what happened on June 1st of 1863 when Harriet Tubman and her ring of spies, scouts, and pilots piloted Colonel James Montgomery, who was the commander of the mission and the commander of the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers. And they were 300 Black soldiers, as well as the Rhode Island, 3rd Rhode Island Heavy Artillery, which was one battery of white soldiers. And Tubman and her spy scouts and pilots piloted them up the sleepy serpentine Combee River in 3 U.S. Army boats. One was and I should say that these boats were steamships, okay? Uh, and one of them was tricked out and souped up as a gunboat. There were small arms placed on it. And these arms, as I said, were small, but they were larger than what the Confederacy had. The other two boats were transport steamers. So these were larger boats designed to transport people, troops, as well as freedom seekers back to safety. So there was very little opposition because the Confederacy had moved its troops. This is the low country, and this June would have been the sickly season, meaning the time of year when rice was growing in the fields, and rice grows in stagnant water, and that same water breeds mosquitoes which carried malaria. So the Confederate Army had moved its troops to higher, healthier, and safer ground, and just left pickets, which are guards. As these three boats are chugging up the river, um, they encounter sandbars at the mouth of the Coosaw River, and this was really the only opposition. And one of the transport steamers ran aground, which must truly have been heartbreaking for Tubman, her spies, scouts, and pilots, and the Second South Carolina Volunteers, who were all formerly enslaved. So the gunboat and the one transport steamer continue up the river. They arrive at Fields Point, and at Fields Point was the location of the first set of Confederate pickets or guards. There are wonderful newspaper articles that talk about the guards fleeing so quickly when they saw the black soldiers that they left their blankets warm. So those guards fled. They sent couriers up to Green Pond to request reinforcements. Those reinforcements were 15 miles away by horseback. The two boats continue up the river. The first plantation where they stop, we know from a freedom seeker by the name of Minus Hamilton, who is one of the stars of the book. I would say he's the leading man. That the enslaved laborers were in the rice fields. It was 4 a.m. Okay. And they are hoeing rice in the dark at 4 a.m. From here, one boat, the transport steamer, stops here. The gunboat continues up the Combee River to a place called Combee Ferry. And at Combee Ferry, there was a pontoon bridge, which is a bridge made out of wood, which was designed to be temporary. So a cavalry could cross over it and then take it up, so the enemy could not cross behind them. Well, the Third Rhode Island heavy artillery took up the bridge. They burned it and destroyed it. The Confederacy was using this entire area and the rice that was grown here. Um, they were trading this rice with England, for example. They're exporting it as well as using it to feed Confederate citizens and Confederate troops, and exporting it despite the fact that the U.S. Navy had a blockade on the waterways in the region. So one of the goals of the raid was to cut this supply line and stop the outflow of rice from this region for export as well as for just general use by the Confederacy. The other goal was to free enslaved people and to fill the ranks of the Second South Carolina Volunteers. Now, many of these soldiers had been enslaved, some of them up until 2 weeks before the war. I'm sorry, 2 weeks before the raid. This was their first time in their uniforms. This was their first time handling muskets. And when they got to the plantation called Cypress that is adjacent to Combee Ferry, they got off the boat. They walked across an embankment of earth to Cypress Plantation, waving flags and ringing bells. And as soon as the enslaved people saw the boats, they ran to the river, or they ran from the rice fields over to the river. Um, we know that up near Combee Ferry, going on to Cypress Plantation, there's an embankment of earth, a raised sort of plateau of earth surrounded by rice fields. The Second South Carolinas, who were called greenhorns because they were so new, having just some of them been liberated themselves, they walked across this embankment very bravely, not knowing if they could be ambushed by the Confederacy. The gunboat positioned itself so that it commanded the river and shot at Confederate pickets and the reinforcements which had recently arrived. And the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers walked onto the plantation and brought the freedom seekers across the embankment onto the boat. They included Friday Barrington. His is one of the stories I tell in the book. Friday escaped bondage on Cypress Plantation before the raid. He went to Beaufort. He was with Colonel James Montgomery before the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers was organized, and he went back to Cypress during the raid and liberated both of his parents, his sister, and his brother-in-law. And his brother-in-law also joined the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers. Another of these soldiers at Combee Ferry was my great 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 grandfather, Hector Fields, there in the lead boat with Harriet Tubman and her spy scouts and pilots and Colonel James Montgomery um, at Combee Ferry. So my vision for Combee was to try to tell the story from the perspective of the people who were freed in the raid, um, and to tell the story of Harriet Tubman's Civil War service, which was really the least known part of her legendary life. And I do this by finding new sources about Harriet Tubman because her Civil War service was not described in the official military record of the Civil War, and finding new sources to uncover the lives of enslaved people because historians had very few tools to do this. And so the backbone of Combee is the U.S. Civil War pension files. The After the boats were loaded up and came back down the Combee, they sailed back to downtown Beaufort to the wharf, and the freedom seekers are taken to a church. At that church, 150 Combee men aged 14 to 70 joined the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers. They enlisted. So, decades after their service, these men, their widows, their dependent children applied for U.S. Civil War pensions. And it's those files that tell the story of the Combee Freedom Seekers' lives and the story of the Combee River Raid. So I'm going to read for you. I have two excerpts. And the first excerpt is from the middle of the book where I'm talking about we're in the action of the raid, and you're going to meet Minus Hamilton, the leading man, an 88-year-old man who told his life story to one of the U.S. Army commanders, Colonel Thomas Wentworth Higginson. A few weeks after the raid, Higginson was the commander of the 1st South Carolina Volunteers, and Hamilton told Higginson about his experiences on June 2nd, 1863. There are so many things about enslaved people and their experiences that we do not and likely will never know. For example, who among the bondspeople in the rice fields up and down the Combee, from just above James L. Paul's plantation to just below Combee Ferry 6 miles upriver, saw the two black smokestacks before the steamboats came around the bend? We'll never know who heard the walking beam turning the John Adams paddle wheels like a huge iron seesaw shimmying up and down above the upper deck and understood that it spelled freedom. We will never know who called it first, but some man, woman, or child who was standing up to their ankles in the muck that dark morning would have yelled, "Yankee gunboat." Minus Hamilton told Colonel Higginson what he and his family experienced when he saw the gunboat. The overseer saw it too. Hamilton likely never had thought he would see such a day in his life, and it was a long life. He had been sold with his wife Hagar and their daughter Bina in 1853 from Edward Rutledge Lowndes' estate to John Parker. On Parker's place, Bina married Harry Mack. Both of them were prime hands and gave birth to Minus's granddaughter, also named Hagar. John Parker's heir, Arthur Middleton Parker, went bankrupt and ultimately sold his plantation and the people he held in bondage to James L. Paul in December 1853. Little Hagar was 4 or 5 when the Lincoln's gunboats came up the Combee. And I'm quoting Mr. Hamilton here, and he is speaking Gullah. Quote, "De brack soldiers so presumptuous, dey come right ashore, hold up their head. First thing I know, there was a barn, 10,000 bushel rough rice all in a blaze. Did Massa great house all crackling up the roof. Didn't care for see 'em blaze. Lord, Massa didn't care nothing at all. I was gwine to the boat," unquote. Hamilton likely considered himself blessed to have lived long enough to see, quote, "de brack soldiers so presumptuous," unquote, as he called them. An enslaved person could not look a white person in the eye without inviting insult or worse injury. In contrast, the black soldiers who came right ashore wearing the Union blue coats and pantaloons and carrying loaded muskets stood with their backs straight and held their heads up. Hamilton told Higginson what he saw after the Second South Carolina Volunteers left Lincoln's gunboat. They went to the slaveholder's barn, where he stored the rice his enslaved labor force had grown and harvested the previous year, 10,000 bushels of rough rice, and set it all on fire. The presumptuous black soldiers did not stop there. The next thing Minus Hamilton saw was the country of state of the man who held him and his family in bondage, engulfed in flames up to the roof. Hamilton's gesticulations became even more animated, Higginson recalled. Higginson may have asked Hamilton how he felt watching the property of the man who legally owned him and his family go up in flames. Hamilton responded, he didn't care anything at all, but he made it clear to Higginson that what he did care about was seizing the opportunity to liberate himself and his family. Quote, "I was going to the boat." Okay, the second short excerpt I'm going to read is from the afterword, in which I'm reflecting on the impact of Combee and the impact of the pension files for helping African Americans find their families, and thus the impact of Harriet Tubman's legacy in the Combee River Raid. Okay. And okay, I, I didn't want this book to be about stories passed down, told about the raid over time. Nor did I want to write another book about what we don't and can't know about enslaved people because of the gaps, silences, and violence of the archival record. Though this work is vital, and I have done some of it myself, particularly on the pre-colonial West African side of the Atlantic. I wanted to extend what can be said and known about the lives of enslaved people and tell the story of the enslaved people who liberated themselves in the Combee River Raid. Because of the pension files, I knew it was possible to unearth the voices of formerly enslaved people, let them tell their own stories, and compel the planners' records to speak to our enslaved ancestors, to my enslaved ancestors. I knew I could contribute to the restoration of the humanity, which the institution of enslavement was designed to deny and strip away. From the first reference I found to gunboats, and then from the names of siblings, parents, grandparents, cousins, aunties, uncles, and sweethearts going back 4 generations, and references to weddings, childbirth, funerals, and burial practices in the pension files, and to family groupings and planners' documents. And speak to me, they did. The Combee freedom seekers' acts of liberation and self-liberation erased their own traces in the planners' historical records and destroyed those records. Simultaneously, when the social order turned upside down and the enslaved people liberated themselves, becoming free people, soldiers, and liberators, it created a small fissure in what had seemed an impenetrable edifice. With this crack, Black soldiers could support themselves and their families because of the bounties and pensions due them for their military service in the Civil War. And because of their pension files, they, along with their widows, children, and neighbors, could tell their stories of enslavement and freedom in their own words. The world turned upside down on June 2nd, 1863, and the Combee River Raid teaches us much more about the intimate lives, loves, families, and labors of enslaved people and formerly enslaved people, finally from their own words, than we ever knew before. With approximately 83,000 African American Civil War veterans approved for pensions, there may be tens of thousands more stories their pension files could tell, and thousands of enslaved communities their files could be used to construct. When we commemorated the 160th anniversary of the Combee River Raid on June 2nd, 2023, we had a lot to celebrate. We could say we know who risked their freedom and their lives to execute one of the greatest slave rebellions in New World history. And we know who got on the boat, liberated themselves, and reunited their families in the raid. Our enslaved ancestors don't have to be nameless, faceless, or storyless anymore. In addition to freedom, this is one of the greatest and most enduring legacies of the Combee River Raid and of Harriet Tubman's Civil War service. We are finally able to say their names, and saying our ancestors' names and telling our stories is a pillar of Black freedom in the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Black. That is the portion that you just read. I read first before because usually I jump around in my own reading style, but I read that before I kind of hit, the chronological order of the chapters. And it really, really, the language that stuck out to me was the application of the self liberation as opposed to what I think has kind of seeped into the national consciousness that, African American peoples were freed by white abolitionists and or Abraham Lincoln.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted you to talk with us about that framing of self-liberation as a way of interrupting that narrative as liberation being something granted or given.
Yeah. So I think that in the sort of literature of slavery, um, about slavery, that language has been the norm now for a decade or so. And understanding that enslaved people, it's really combating the notion that enslaved people who free themselves are fugitives, right? Even though they stole their freedom, even though they were legally someone's property, but focusing more on their agency and their will to be free and the act of them liberating themselves. Um, and the notion that, I mean, it just we can't even get our head around today, 21st century, what it would have taken for someone to achieve freedom under those circumstances. And so really emphasizing the self-liberation, that they had the will, they found the means to get themselves to freedom, even when there are helpers, right? At the end of the day, they're the ones who would have borne the consequences.
Right. And I'm also thinking about that how this is also a history of coalition, right?
Hmm.
For the framing of interrupting the idea of the fugitive, which also puts a question to the human morality of the law, right? Just because it's the
Hmm.
law does not mean that it actually makes the person interrupting the law a fugitive if it is their human right
Correct.
to seek their liberation or exercise their free mobility. But another facet of this is the coalition. You talk about Garrison, you talk about John Brown's relationship with
Hmm.
Frederick Douglass. And so this is also a story about creating communities of political and social affinity as a
Hmm.
way of changing what, as you said, seems to be forever, seems to be uninterruptible. And I was wondering more about the dynamic between the self liberation, the freedom dreams of the freedom seekers, and then the environment of coalition that was
Hmm.
happening in the United States at the time.
Hmm. One could not have happened without the other. Um, there were coalitions and certainly coalitions of abolitionists in the North. And the way those stories are told, all of the abolitions are white and all the slaves are black. And we know now that that was not true. There were many black abolitionists. There were freed people who risked their freedom so other people could be free. And so they are a very important part of that coalition. I think what's interesting is that in November 1861, there's the Battle of Port Royal, and the U.S. Navy sort of occupies Port Royal Sound and takes out two forts, and then the U.S. Army occupies Beaufort, Port Royal, and the Sea Islands. And you have some of these northern abolitionists and or their children who drop everything and go down to South Carolina. There were about 8,000 enslaved people who liberated themselves. Legally, they are not yet free, but they were no longer in bondage. And so the coalition shifts to the South, right? And people who had in the North been working and organizing and raising money and raising awareness for a couple decades, they now actually have something to do. And some of them do come down and volunteer to do it, whether it's opening stores, schools, missionary work, medical care. They freed people needed a lot of medical care, um, and organizing labor to pick the Sea Island cotton crop. So part of that coalition, I mean, and it's always a multiracial coalition. And so you do have, Charlotte Forten, who's a black woman, young black woman born in Philadelphia, the fourth generation in her family to be born free, who goes to South Carolina as a teacher,
Mm.
right? And then shortly thereafter, you have men in Georgia and in South Carolina and then in Florida who are freed, some of them in the Battle of Port Royal, who then join the black regiments. And so they're free and they're risking their freedom, right? Fighting for and their lives, fighting for the US Army and liberating other people. So this coalition continues to grow and more people continue to put their lives on the line. And the 200,000 black soldiers who fought in the Civil War were also joined, and it was became a total of about 500,000 freedom seekers
Hmm.
who ran and liberated themselves during the Civil War. And it was their actions, not Lincoln and not the abolitionists, that made the end of slavery inevitable.
The inevitability of the slavery is also kind of bound up with the economic world that you paint in Combee as well, right?
Hmm.
As some historians and other people may know, the Industrial Revolution was putting a lot of pressure on the United States to leave the agrarian plantation society and move into something different. You paint these striking pictures from the archive of the difference between the ways different levels of society live. You talk about one family's access to travels in Russia, the things they have in their houses, the expensive artwork, and you draw the line directly, sincerely, and without fear between where the resources for industrialization and the flourishing of modernity in the West come from. And I
Hmm.
wanted you to speak more to that connection in
Yeah.
terms of like the intimate impact that this economy had on the lives of Black people.
Hmm. Because the resources for the lifestyles and the mobility and just the grandeur of the slaveholding class came from the backs of enslaved people. You
Mm.
know, in early drafts of Combee, I was criticized for spending too many pages talking about white folks.
I mean, you got to tell the truth.
I
Yeah,
had to tell the
tell the
truth.
truth.
And I wanted to do exactly what you said, which is to draw this contrast. And how else could I do that without talking about the lives of the planters and being able to show what allowed them to live this kind of lifestyle, you know, and particularly when you're talking about rice plantations, which were so deadly to enslaved people, the disease environment, the environment itself was so deadly, and this rice was so profitable for much of, you know, the 19th century up to the Civil War, that it was a one-to-one correlation. And
Mm.
so obviously I ignored my critics, because I had a grand plan. But I think it's also interesting because the sources that I use to tell the story are also so intimately connected. So the lives of Black people and the white people who held them in bondage were just tightly woven together for better or for worse. And I couldn't tell one without the other. And going back to the question of modernity, couldn't have happened, right, without the labor of enslaved Black people. And the South wasn't ready to give it up.
No, no.
They were not ready to give it up. They were fighting, of course, to keep it, despite what some people would say.
You hit the transnational impact of slavery as well, how the work that was done in the American South and then for a little while, Midwest, Southwest, actually fueled an international economy, right?
Hmm.
And if
Hmm.
you only have to dig so far, because I started digging as I was reading to understand that cotton trade in the American South and the Caribbean was tied transnationally to India, which is
Yep.
tied transnationally in some respects, sometimes to even China, which is tied back to Western Europe. The breadth of the descriptions that you give, even in if you do a material study of the objects that you talk about that are in the
Yes.
houses of white folks, just so clearly reveals how Black communities and individuals in the American South and also throughout Latin America and the global South are literally fueling this new level of consumption,
Yes.
right, of consuming that we have reached. And for
Hmm.
me that makes Combee stand as extremely important to the moment that we are in. When
Hmm.
you finally, you know You couldn't edit one more word, you couldn't change one more thing, could you have imagined that it would be so
Uh,
critical to the moment that we're in right now?
no, I may have had an inkling, but I think that I don't know that most of us, or I'll say most people that I know, would have imagined that we'd be where we are. And so, therefore, it would be hard for me to imagine the timeliness of the story because I couldn't imagine being here. I was imagining a very different future for us all. But I think, here we are. And I think Combee speaks to today in many ways.
I mean, even though the circumstances are different, there is a point at which it just seemed like a playbook. It seemed very instructional to the kinds of communities that we should be beginning
Yes.
to recreate right now, right?
Yes.
Um, and so I was also thinking about the different ways that so much of the law that you outline and describe for us in Combee in relation to making a human being property are so relevant. And one of the connections I thought about were the fugitive slave laws. Anyone that
Hmm.
held someone enslaved could be jailed, dispossessed, or even
Hmm.
put to death. You're thinking of the case of John Brown, Harper's Ferry.
Hmm.
And also thinking about the immediate risk that there was to even being socially seen or in contact with someone who was enslaved. It reminded me of when Florida passed the laws criminalizing people that even shared a vehicle with someone who was undocumented. Like
Right.
that example immediately came to my head. In your
Hmm.
research, what do you see between the connection? What do you see in the connection between these older laws and their transformation to the laws that are just seem to be proliferating across every
Hmm.
community?
Hmm. Well, it's a very old playbook, right? And another piece of the fugitive slave law, which I think is incredibly relevant today, is that local and state law enforcement have to cooperate, right? They become slave catchers according to federal law, so that any person who accuses and just claims that this person is their property, now local and state law enforcement has to enforce that person's property right, no matter where they live, right? And so the notion that there's no sanctuary cities, no sanctuary places. Local and state law enforcement have to comply and be mobilized to detain undocumented people, and then turn them over, to immigration, I think is also very relevant today. I also think, we didn't even talk about abortion,
Let's
right?
talk about abortion. Even the relation of that, this idea that if you witness, no matter HIPAA, doctors,
Right.
there's this violation of the intimacy of one's own access and sovereignty over their body because
Yep.
they're birthing capable. That
Yep.
also seems very
Hmm.
akin, if not derived from the fugitive slave laws themselves, especially in terms of partus sequitur ventrum, right? The condition follows the
Right.
womb, which became a 1662 slave code in Virginia and then spread, which means the
Hmm.
offspring of any enslaved Black woman is property.
Hmm. Hmm. And today, that if you witness, if you assist, if you transport a woman to have an abortion, you've been criminalized. You know, it's just there's so many parallels. Um, I think it shows the stakes. And this is what I don't know that we're quite, when I say we, I mean just general American society, are quite there yet to understanding just how high the stakes are. And I feel like during the Civil War, um, the coalition that we're speaking of, they knew the stakes. And this is why they were willing to sacrifice, those white abolitionists sacrificed some of them their livelihoods, right? Those black abolitionists and black freedom seekers potentially sacrificed their lives and certainly sacrificed their freedom. And for many of them, as I say in Combee, they would have rather died than be re-enslaved.
Mhm.
So sacrificing their life and their freedom was one and the same. Yet they were willing to put it on the line because they knew that freedom wasn't free. We don't seem to know that. They knew that until everybody was free, they were not truly free, that their freedom was in jeopardy.
Right.
So they could have all been comfortable. You know, Harriet Tubman could have stayed in Philly.
Mhm.
She could have stayed in Massachusetts. She really could have stayed in Canada. She could have minded her business. She could have done her thing, but no, not only does she go back 13 times into the mouth of the lion, the prison house of bondage, as I call it, to bring family members, community members out. Then she goes to South Carolina. They knew the stakes. We don't seem to know them.
There's this um, ideation of whiteness that everybody is kind of compelled through various channels to participate in, no matter where they are nowadays. And it has been that way for a very long time. And it seems like the racialization of the idea of liberation, as it's tied to now using DEI as a stand-in for other kind of slurs, right, through a misrepresentation of the law and history,
Hmm.
there is this way that, as you said, we are unprepared or not ready to acknowledge that we're still in the same historic trajectory. We're still in the same stream of history. It's like the problems haven't been solved, and it's because people think, oh, that's just something that happens to them.
Hmm.
Or now you have a certain population of white people that think that this cannot be extended to them, when in all for all purposes it has been, in terms of abortion laws, in terms of disabled people losing their rights, in terms of the fugitive the relation of present immigration laws to the Fugitive Slave Act, and how now you're starting to see more and more testimony from these isolated white communities about them sometimes losing their spouse who is an immigrant, who has
Hmm.
been detained by ICE. What do you see in the coalition that was in the archive that you think right now is critical to attempt to make a contemporary version of?
Hmm. I think it's the willingness, number one, to see the other. It's a willingness to see other people's humanity and to fight for it, even if it means a loss to yourself, right? Garrett, Thomas Garrett. Okay.
Yeah, Thomas
And
Garrett.
John Hunn. So they had helped a family of freedom seekers who came to his home in Delaware. And because of the Fugitive Slave Act, law enforcement gets involved, and it's a long story, but he ends up being tried and convicted and lost his business. He lost he was fined an enormous amount of money. It was called being mulcted.
Mm.
And he's in the courtroom at sentencing, and the judge is telling him how much he's going to have to pay. Thousands of dollars even today, right? Then as well as now. And this is a time when he could have expressed contrition. And he turns around and tells the audience he's going to do it again. And if anybody knew an enslaved person, a poor slave who needed rest and who needed safety, to call him. I mean, he got caught. He was fined. He literally lost his livelihood, and he didn't care. He's ready to sacrifice again if that's what it took to
Mhm.
ultimately bring this institution, this evil institution, down. We need more people like that, right? And this is a white man. We need someone to see other people's humanity, people who don't look like them, people who do look like them sometimes, right? We need people people who have just denied their own self-interest. So it's not even about seeing the other. It's
Right.
about seeing yourself.
It's about making the decision that you would not want to be touched by something so evil that is happening. And so in protecting your in realizing your that your liberation and your health and safety are bound up with your neighbor, no matter where they may be, you decide to
That's right.
sacrifice to make sure that you and everyone else will be safe, that the thing does not exist anywhere at
That's
all.
right. That's what we're missing. That's what we're missing.
So there is the connection that you have with your great 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 grandfather, who was a part of the Combahee River Raid. Did you know that before you did the research, or did you discover it during the research? And then, as you let us know when you found this information, what is it like doing this painstaking work in the archive? I know my experience in the archive is just very slow. It can be very frustrating. It can be sometimes disappointing. And then you have moments where you find something in a place where you never imagined it would be, and then you're like, how did I miss it, even though there was no way for you to know it was even there? So as you're working in the archive, what's that like? And then what was it like to find your relative as a part of what you say one of the greatest liberation acts in the history of the Americas?
Yeah. So, some people assume that I wrote the book because of Hector Fields, and that is not the case. I didn't know, you know. Um, I mm, I write about in the afterword my first visit to our f sacred family burial ground, Fields
Mm,
family burial ground in Colleton County. Um, and really the trauma that I experienced. Um, with the state of the cemetery, and there was one of our ancestors' graves that was broken open,
mm,
um, and it was full of water, and I saw his skeletal remains. This started me down a path. I will say this pushed me over an edge, where I started really digging into the family history and kind of taking up the responsibility that that I realize now our family patriarch had left me. So I had the names from Hector Fields down to my grandfather, Jim Fields, Little Jim, um, father to son. That's all we had. And my cousin did this research in the census years ago, and he gave it to me years ago, and I had it in a folder, and the folder was in a file. And as I was, mourning this cemetery, I reached out and I pulled it up. Okay. Because I had to find the Fields family, period. I had to find the Fields family. Our graves in that cemetery were unmarked. They are unmarked. We really didn't know what was going on. We didn't know who we were. And I was in a state.
understandably, understandably.
And I
Absolutely.
turned to my friend, Tony Carrier, who was the director of the International African American Museum Center for Family History in Charleston. It wasn't open then, it's open now, but the center was already up and running and programming. And Tony took one look at my little Xerox page and she's like, oh, Hector Fields. He's a Civil War veteran in Beaufort. Well, my dad's family lives in Colleton. I was like, Tony, we don't know those people. So she's like, okay, just stop crying, just give me that and let me cook, let me do my thing.
Exactly.
And so she documented that this was actually our great grandfather. He was a Civil War veteran. So I then, and mind you, I'm working on a book that's not about Combee, it's about the Gullah Geechee. And I think it's totally separate from this. And I'm working on the Requiem, which I started because of the cemetery. The Requiem for Rice is really about the cemetery. Um, and I'm working on the family history, and I see these three things as totally separate. Okay. So I started digging around in the pension files at Tony's direction looking for Hector.
Hmm.
Hector didn't have a pension file. So then Tony started digging in the pension files. She found out, she found his brother Jonas. We knew father to son, no siblings, no children, straight line. And we didn't know Hector's parents. And this pension file of his brother, their sister testified, names of their parents,
Amazing.
names of her brothers, where the parents and the brother, not Hector, were all enslaved, how they became separated before the war. My aunt, who was testifying, was given away as a wedding gift, and how they got separated during the war. Jonas Field's wife, the slaveholder sent the men to one state, the women to another state. He was separated from his wife. She went crazy, and they never lived together again. And then she says that after the war, her two brothers, Hector and Jonas, went to Whitehall to live where my dad's family lives now.
Mm-hmm.
There were other people in the pension file who testified about growing up with Jonas Fields. So I had this enslaved community. And I had been digging in the pension files about the Combee raid, and I had found separately, again, I thought all this was separate. I had already found testimony in the files, Combee freedom seekers testifying about the raid.
Hmm.
With this information from my family, I thought, oh my goodness, I can reconstruct the Combee community. I can reconstruct this community before, during, and after the raid. That was the catalyst. Now, working in the archives, I had I had a diversity of archival experience. Most of the time, it was incredibly frustrating. It's important to note that the records of these seven plantations were all burned. Okay. And it actually took me a while to figure that out. So I wasn't going to get anything from the plantations themselves.
Hmm.
So I had to use the friends, family, and neighbor approach. Um, these were some incredibly wealthy families. Two of them were the most, some of the wealthiest families in South Carolina and in the U.S. South. So they had multiple plantations. They had homes in Charleston. The county records for Beaufort and Colleton were also burned completely in the Civil War. But what I found is that because these planters were so rich and had so much property, they filed all their deeds in Charleston.
Okay.
So we were able to document the slave transactions when uh, the freedom seekers testified in their pension files about when they were bought, mortgaged, handed down in families, given away as gifts, all of that. I was able to document about 80% of that from these plantation sources that are filed in Charleston instead of Beaufort and Colleton County. And I'm especially proud of this because this puts the African American history of those two counties on the map where it did not exist before. And these are the two counties where my dad's family is from. Um, in using the friends and family approach, I had to find out who they drank with, who they hunted with, who they met, which families they married into, who were their neighbors, and then look in those collections. Um, before COVID, when I could actually go to the library, um, you know, there were days when none of the stuff is cataloged. So
Oh,
I'm talking getting into the boxes and turning over every single page. And that's how I found this amazing document, the slave list that William L. Kirkland wrote days after the raid. And it's in his wife's family's collection,
mhm.
right? And Kirkland dies in 1864. It's in his widow's family's collection. He doesn't have a collection. Um, then during COVID, I was still doing archival research because as I was writing and I'm trying to connect these dots, first of all, we transcribed all of the pension files. And
Wow.
yeah, I started out doing that myself, and then I was able, with Carnegie Mellon's help, to hire research assistants.
Mhm.
Transcribed about 200 pension files. Some of them are 300 pages of cursive writing, so that was fun. And then I would cut and paste the transcriptions and put them into a big spreadsheet so I could keyword search them. So the frustration would be to transcribe this 200-page thing and get to the end of it and still not know where the couple was enslaved, right? Still not be able to identify any of the people. I couldn't put them on any family trees. I didn't know what plantation they were on. That was not a good day. Um,
You were just relying
right.
on the fire inside you.
I would say it was like, shut up in my bones, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
But I would just keep building the database. And there would be these little clues like who married the couple if they got married before the war. If I knew that, I could search my database 8 times out of 10, I could figure out from another couple's wedding where they married. There were people we couldn't find. We couldn't find Minus Hamilton for the longest time.
Mhm.
And we had to find Minus Hamilton. And, as you said, it's like you read something and nothing. And you come back a couple weeks later and you read it again, having read other files and other things. And now it makes sense. Now I
Yes.
understood what it meant. So I was talking with the genealogist from the International African American Museum, who was one of my research assistants. And we would go through the people we were looking for, and every week it was minus Hamilton, nothing for months. So I finally said, we're going to have to move on, but read me what you have from the Freedmen's Bank accounts one more time. Oh, there is this woman who says her father's name is Minus.
He
What's her
showed up.
name?
He
He
showed
showed up,
up.
and I recognized her immediately from the pension files. And
Mhm.
I searched my database, and there she was. There's this amazing document of about 5 women, several of them today we would call Gold Star widows. Their husbands died in action. And coming to testify for a woman whose husband died in action, then she took up with another man and still collected her husband's pension. And they're testifying that she's not actually married to this man and she's still her dead husband's widow.
Mhm.
So I remembered this document.
Get the bag. Get the bag. Get the bag.
So there were lots and lots and lots of days and weeks of frustration. And then I would find these nuggets, right? And that nugget would keep me going for weeks until I found another nugget. It could be reading a pension file and all of a sudden they start talking about the raid.
Mhm.
And I don't know why, it's like you don't get the questions in the file, you just get their responses. So why on that day, who said what to get the veterans and the widows one after another talking about the raid? And then I'd get nothing for months. And then I'd get another. So So I just had to live on that, the past.
What were some of the things that you were doing personally, if you don't mind, to help sustain yourself during this
Yeah.
process? Because I think that young scholars, or even people who aren't scholars but are just doing genealogy work, sometimes you just hit so many roadblocks, and also that myth that we're not documented is so prevalent that the myth and the exhaustion meet, and then you give up. How
Yeah.
did you keep yourself going during years of research?
Yeah. So I actually spent quite a bit of time on the Combee River and at two of the plantations that were destroyed in the raid. And I had access to the others. And so when I was down there, and even when I'm in Pittsburgh, wherever I am, I'm a walker, and I really became a walker during COVID. So I would just walk for miles and miles. And if I was in the low country, I'd be walking through the rice fields on the Combee, walking along the river. Whenever I got stuck, I would walk. Um, I read a lot of I read fiction by African American authors, and that would help when I got stuck. It's like, okay, if I can't write, I would read, and I would read, and I would read, and then you know, I'd get some creative juices flowing and I would start writing again. I think what really kept me going at the end of the day was my ancestors, you
Yeah.
know? And the responsibility that I felt to tell their story and to tell our story. In my darkest days, that's what kept me going. And I remember I wrote this in the afterword, and I wrote the afterword outside of Charleston at a place called Middleton Place, and it was probably November.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, oh, I'm going down. And I purposely said, I'm going to write this afterward while I'm down there. And I was beginning to figure out that all of this was actually connected. And I wanted to go visit the cemetery. Well, November is hunting season.
Okay. You were out
It's
there.
I was out there. It's duck hunting season, so
You were
that's
out
not
there.
something one should do,
Yeah.
at that time of year. So what I realized is that I could, and I was going to the cemetery in my mind whenever I needed to. That's what kept me going, right? That trauma of seeing my ancestors' skeletal remains, the trauma of not knowing my family, of knowing who we were, of knowing where we're buried, what is our history. That is what kept me going when I wanted to give up. And just wanting to be able to tell this story and tell it from the freedom seekers' perspectives, that kept me going.
So, my last two questions are kind of about just womanhood and your experience with that. You mentioned the Gold Star widows and how
Hmm.
they would like vouch for each other to make sure that they could have the wherewithal to continue raising the generations of their family and, of course, maintaining themselves. But you also offer so much poignant emotional information about Harriet Tubman's life, from her husband refusing to see her and then remarrying, the loss of some of the family that wouldn't go with her because
Hmm.
they couldn't leave behind their youngest, or they didn't want to leave anybody behind. What is something that you learned about Harriet Tubman that changed your perspective of her as a historical figure, just forever? Something you never
Hmm.
expected to learn about her.
Hmm.
Because I like the description you gave of you had this moment, this poetic moment where you were like, she thought about going down there and showing up to the house with her husband and
Yes.
making a fit with her husband.
Right.
And I loved, because I think you, as I remember, she actually said she thought about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
No.
I thought that was beautiful. And I wanted to,
Hmm.
and so I gotta, how do I got a feeling of Harriet as a, like not this historical figure, but like a sister. Like, no, I was going down there because I was going to set it off. And that made me connect even more. So what's,
Hmm.
aside from that, what are some other things you learned about her that made you just connect more that you never expected?
Yeah, you know, mm, there's so many things. Let me see which one I want to highlight. Um, I think one of my favorite parts of her autobiography is when Tubman talks about arriving in Philadelphia and realizing very quickly that she was by herself, and what would freedom mean to her if she was the only one who was free?
Mm,
And without her family and without her friends, with them still in bondage, you know, it's like, why am I here? There's that. There's also, and I think that, and then what I'm about to talk about now were really motivating factors for her. The fact that her two older sisters were sold
mhm,
and sold away from the family, sold away probably to the deep south, never recovered. At least one of the two, I don't remember the full details off the top of my head, but at least one of the two left young children. She was separated from her young children. And I feel like Tubman, in so many ways, never recovered from the trauma of losing her sisters. And I don't think her family ever recovered from the trauma of losing their daughters and their sisters. Um, and I think in so many ways, it motivated her to help other people keep their families together, to reunite their families. I think she was very much motivated by family and beyond her own family, right?
mhm,
And in many ways, she was willing to risk herself and her ability to be here and be a member of her family so that other people could be with their families. And I, it's it's almost impossible for us to fathom something like that today. It really is. That level of selflessness and that level of sacrifice. And even when she was really wounded, when her husband took up with someone else. Um, but she decided not to make trouble
mhm,
because she would have been discovered and she could have been tortured, she could have been sold, she could have been re-enslaved, any number of things could have happened to her. And then she would not be able to help other people. So that was also very much a turning point for her to begin to decide that that was her mission, really, to help other people get out of bondage. Um, I think those are the things that really unlocked in me. Uh, it took my admiration for Tubman to a new level, right?
mm.
Learning those things about her gave me a deeper understanding of who she was.
And what is it about the land? Because in my own kind of research, I came across a Lenape feminist scholar, Joanne Barker, who
Hmm.
wrote about the occupation of Lenape, but also Cherokee people in the region before, right? We had the
Hmm.
opening of colonization. And she kind of links that history of feminism to the Combahee River Collective while also mentioning Harriet Tubman. And
Hmm.
you were of this space, and you also provide so much like ecological narrative. You narrate the ecology. You give us
Thank you.
such a deep description of what's leading to the climax, the opening acts that have us in the climactic crisis that we're in today with the runoff and the changing of, hurricane patterns in the season. All of this is related to the way that the land was treated over time.
Hmm.
What is it about that space that just seems to breed immense amounts of transformation for anybody who's ever been on that land? You've experienced it. You've documented yourself there over generations and generations.
Hmm.
For you, what is the land giving that makes people from around there just go, absolutely not?
Oh, where to start? Well, let me start here in saying that in reading about Harriet Tubman's life, her biographies, I was really struck that her biographers painted the Low Country as the same as the Maryland Eastern Shore.
No.
I'm like, what? I mean, because I know the Low Country so well, I just couldn't sit with that any longer.
And you pointed
So,
that out. You pointed out that she
yes,
said, I could not understand the Gullah Geechee
right,
dialect of English when I went down there. So people were
right.
even speaking different communal dialects of English across different enslaved communities.
Exactly, exactly. So there's this whole creolization process.
Mm-hmm.
And Black folks at that time understood the differences. They knew who was from here and not from here. And I say, though, they did have some commonalities, one of which was the age structure in the enslaved community, the old heads, right? Harriet Tubman talked about the old heads, and the Combee freedom seekers talked about the old heads also.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody would become an old head if they just kept living. Um, and you had freedom, right? That they all wanted to be free. They all yearned to be free. So the Combee freedom seekers, even though they laughed when they heard her talk, they recognized that in Harriet Tubman, and she recognized that in them. Um, so part of what I wanted to do, I wanted to make the land a character.
It definitely
And
is. It's very powerful. It's
thank
very
you.
powerful.
I wanted to show the reader that the Low Country was not the same as the Maryland Eastern Shore. And I wanted to narrate enslaved people's experiences on the land so that, and with the land, and in these rice fields that were built by our enslaved ancestors, right? Um, and the impact that that work took on their lives, on their bodies, on their families. And that's the same labor that created the wealth that the slaveholders, used, exploited to fuel their lifestyles. So it was really important so that by the time the gunboats came at 4 a.m., you knew not only who the enslaved people were, but what they'd been through,
Yes.
right? You knew what their lives were like working on this land. And you could carry that with you and you could celebrate with them as they ran to freedom. Freedom from bondage, freedom from toil, freedom from exploitation to make other people wealthy. That's what I wanted the reader to feel. Um,
Which is
I
universal.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I was in residence on the Combee for about 18 months intensively. I've been working in the region for years. Um, I am principal investigator for a group of scientists down there. And so we went out and did a number of reenactments to measure and to test and to so I could figure out what I'm reading in these sources and try to map it on the land and then find the ways to describe it for the reader so that the reader feels like she's there.
Yes. And my last question, and this has been an incredible conversation. I'm so grateful to you and your work and your ancestors.
Thank you.
If you could decide what readers take away from Combee, or if you had a hope for what the majority of people who read take away, what would that be?
Hmm. I would want them to see our enslaved ancestors as mothers and fathers and husbands and wives and sisters and brothers and cousins and sweethearts and baby mamas.
Yeah.
Just to see them as people and to see them as neighbors and community. I want to restore the humanity of the enslaved, which that evil institution was really designed to deny us. Um, and I want us to be proud.
Yeah.
I want us to be proud of them
You
and all
achieve
they went through.
Well, you achieved that for me. This is the text of the time. It's a big text, but if you go buy it, go borrow it, go support your local public library, go borrow it and buy it if you can. It's a long book, but read 10 pages a day if you can. Read 100 pages on the weekend, work your way through it slowly. Get this education because it's the education we're going to need for at least the next 10 years or so. We have a
Yes.
lot of work to do. You've given us a tome of information on how to do that work and how to bring it into the contemporary moment. Keep up with Lit Friday. Come see us when I interview Ayale and Ma and all the wonderful people we have coming through. Follow me on Instagram at hang in there _kitty and also follow the August Wilson African American Cultural Center on Instagram. Keep up with what's coming next. We'll keep you posted about all the wonderful, incredible, groundbreaking work that Dr. Edda does for us. And have a great night. And we are so thankful to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.